Hello everybody and welcome back to our Professional Development Webinar Series for Parish and Diocesan Ministers. Thank you for joining us today for a presentation titled Where Two or Three Are Texting, Incarnation and Sacrament in the Virtual World with Jonathan Sullivan. For those of you who are with us for the first time, my name is Jared Dees. I'm the Digital Publishing Specialist at Ave Maria Press, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. This webinar is brought to you exclusively by Ave Maria Press in partnership with the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions, and questions may be sent to our presenter using the questions section of the GoToWebinar panel, which you can see displayed here. Please take a moment to find that question section of your GoToWebinar panel and simply click the send button at the bottom right-hand corner to send your questions to our presenter, and I'll read as many of those questions as I can at the end of the presentation today. And I believe Jonathan will talk about this, but there's also a hashtag, a Twitter hashtag for this webinar called Virtual Faith, and I'll try to be paying attention to that as well as Jonathan is talking. So, I'd like to send a very warm welcome to Jonathan Sullivan. Jonathan is the Director of Catechetical Services for the Diocese of Springfield, Illinois. He's also a course facilitator for the Virtual Learning Community for Faith Formation and a former chair of the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership's Technology Committee. Jonathan received his BA in Theology and Pastoral Ministry from Quincy University and his MA from Aquinas Institute of Theology. And he blogs on catechesis and evangelization at www.jonathanfsullivan.com and lives in Springfield, Illinois with his wife and 6 children. So Jonathan, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Jared. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Well, I'm going to hand controls over to you, and you can pull up your presentation.
Okay.
Okay, looks good.
All right. Well, thank you again, Jared, for inviting me to give this presentation, and welcome to everyone that's joining us today in this virtual space, which we'll be using a bit as a test subject for our conversation today. As Jared mentioned, we do have a hashtag for the presentation today. If you're on Twitter and want to have that kind of going alongside the presentation to have a virtual space for some conversation with your fellow attendees, I invite you to do that. The hashtag is virtualfaith. I've got some preloaded tweets that will go along during the presentation, so you'll see a few of mine pop up as well through the magic of scheduling on Twitter. So again, it's a nice opportunity to have some side conversation along with the presentation itself. And there'll be some more resources that I'll be posting there after the presentation. I want to start with a short opening prayer. This prayer is taken from the Mass for Christmas during the day. It's the Collect prayer. Whenever I do presentations or even in meetings in my diocese, I like to look at the Collect prayers, either for the day or the one that might speak to whatever topic we're speaking on. And this one speaks very nicely to one of the themes we're going to be talking today, which is incarnation and the physicality of our faith. So I invite you to take a moment to quiet yourselves and remind yourself that we are here in God's presence. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. O God, who wonderfully created the dignity of human nature, and still more wonderfully restored it, grant, we pray, that we may share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. So again, thank you for joining us today for Where Two or Three Are Texting, Incarnation and Sacrament in a Virtual World. I want to start by just giving you a quick overview of how we're going to be spending our time together today. The outline is on your screen here. I'm going to start by talking about a little bit about farming digital dirt and making some connections between how people are living and playing in virtual spaces before making the transition into how they're living their faith online. We're going to take a look specifically at some online faith practices. What is actually going on in these digital spaces when we talk about living our faith in cyberspace, when we talk about using online tools as a means of living our Christian faith. So some real specific examples of ways different traditions, not just Catholic, but a number of Protestant traditions as well, what they're doing online, experimenting with these digital spaces. We'll take a look then at how this challenges our Catholic beliefs and practices. as people are more and more engaged online, what questions are they going to be asking, and what questions are they going to be asking us about why we do things the way we do, why we say no to certain practices online, things like that. And then I'll give a couple of suggestions on how we can bridge physical faith with virtual faith. Because one thing I want to walk away from this presentation with folks understanding is it's not that we're saying no to living out faith online. As Catholic Christians, we may set up certain parameters, but there is value to what is available online. And so how can we bridge that gap and invite people to move from the virtual faith into the physical space with us? And then we'll have some time for Q&A, as Jared talked about. So farming digital dirt, what do I mean by that? A couple of months ago, Thomas McDonald, who writes on the blog God and the Machine, had a really interesting blog post about the sudden explosion of virtual simulation games. And that may be something you may or may not be familiar with. If you owned a PC back in the 90s, you may have been familiar with Microsoft Flight Simulator, which was a simulator that allowed you to get into the cockpit of real planes. So you could fly a Cessna, you could fly a Boeing, take off from the airport. It had all the gadgets and dials and everything in the cockpit in front of you, and you had to do what pilots do, managing altitude and speed and all of this, and you could fly from airport to airport in what was then fairly crude graphics, but still recognizable as different cities and things like that. Well, this simulation of tasks has exploded now, so it's not just flight simulators that we're looking at, but he was writing about a farm simulation, that there are now people who, in their free time, for fun, do real-time virtual farming. And I'm not talking about Farmville on Facebook or something like that, but lush 3D graphics where you're sitting in a tractor in real time, plowing a field, planting seeds, waiting for the crops to grow in real time. And he was struck at kind of how interesting and odd this was, that people would be seeking to do these very mundane kind of tasks in a virtual world where you're not actually reaping any crop, where you're not actually going to be making money by selling fruits and vegetables and things like that, but just how this inundation of mundane tasks in the virtual world, what an interesting shift that was, even to the point where there's now a garbage truck simulator where you drive around neighborhoods in real time, pick up people's garbage, take it to the garbage dump, and dump it out, and all of this. And this really got me thinking then about, what does it mean when we enter these virtual spaces? What does it mean when we live in these types of worlds? And people are increasingly doing that. They're moving into these virtual spaces and experiencing life through them. They are doing formerly physical activities in the virtual world. So they're playing, they're interacting, and yes, they are praying online. They are engaging in faith traditions and lighting candles online for prayer, and even in some instances experimenting with online sacraments and asking, what does this look like? And as pastoral leaders, as pastors, as catechetical leaders, as liturgists, I think we need to be thinking about what the implication of this when people look to their Catholic tradition and ask, what can we do online? Is it okay to pray the rosary with someone on Skype? Is it okay to set up webcams and do Eucharistic adoration over the internet? What are the boundaries there? What's appropriate? What's not appropriate? So two questions that kind of I want to think about overarching with this presentation are, what is the role of digital faith communities in the universal church? And I'm going to take it for granted that there is a role. The question I will ask is, what is that role? And what are the limits in Catholic faith practices online? And honestly, this is all so new and so transitory, these questions, that I don't think that I'm going to be giving you a whole lot of answers. Part of this presentation is just raising the questions. What do we need to be aware of as we move forward? So, I'll do my best to answer questions as we go forward, but these technologies are so new, and what people are trying with them is moving so fast that just asking the questions, I think, is a good step forward for us. So let's take a look then at online faith practices. What is actually going on in these digital spaces? And I've got 5 kind of general categories that I want to take a look at in terms of what people are actually doing online to practice their faith. The first is they're using these digital spaces to share resources. This is probably the most simple way that people are interacting online, just sharing resources, links, whether that's links to the latest apostolic exhortation through the Vatican's website, to the USCCB, which has just a wide range now of online resources that you can link to or download and share with folks in the real world. but there's not a lot of interaction in these types of resources. They tend to be more static pages where people can just go and read or watch or listen, depending on what that resource is. But there may or may not be, the opportunity to comment or actually engage in any sort of interaction with the folks that are posting that. This is just putting stuff up online for people to access. That's probably the most simple, the most basic way that people are using internet resources to practice their faith, to learn more about their faith. The second then would be online faith communities, and this is a little more sophisticated. This is where there are actual groups or spaces set up for people to come and to interact online, to ask questions or share things and experiences online. For instance, I'm currently facilitating an online book study around a book on evangelization, and we have a platform that we're using where we post questions, we answer questions, there's threaded discussions, and we're reading this book together and discussing it together online. Facebook groups are another way that a lot of people are starting to do this, and even parishes now are starting to set up Facebook groups where people can have that kind of interaction, come together, and maybe it's a Bible study, or maybe it's just a prayer support group where people can go and post their prayer intentions, and people can respond to those prayer intentions, let people know that they're praying for each other. But it's usually asynchronous. That is, people aren't coming together in real time. It's more I post something at this time, then maybe a couple hours later someone else posts something. So there's still that interaction, but it's not a real-time kind of interaction. But it's a space where people can come together and share together and interact together. Next would be kind of prayer in cyberspace, and there's some real interesting stuff going on in this realm. One that I'm really familiar with is there's a number of Twitter accounts and people on Twitter who post the text of the Angelus at certain times of day so that people can come together on Twitter, and as they're reading through their feed, they see all the little snippets of text. Now, it's 140 characters at a time, but they are praying the Angelus together online. They are doing that at the same time in a same space, if you will, through Twitter. And there's different ways that you can do that. Certainly what we did right at the start of this webinar, coming together, you can hear me, you could see me praying that text and praying together with that intention, with that prayer. Not in the same physical space, but with the same intention and gathered in a digital way. So online prayer is another way people are experimenting with this, and what can we do in terms of praying together in online spaces. Fourth would be broadcasting of live services. This is what you can do on Sunday morning, turning on your television and seeing the Mass or another Christian service actually being broadcast, sometimes via tape, sometimes live, so that you can follow along with the Mass from your home or wherever you happen to be at. This is another way and that the bishops have encouraged, especially for the Mass, so that people who are homebound or don't have some regular access to the physical Mass can at least participate. Now, the bishops are clear in their statement on televised Masses that it's not the same as going to a church and participating in the Eucharist, but for those that's just not possible, it's at least a way that they can be connected to the community and feel like they are participating. Now, ideally, even if they have access to a local community, that local community after the Mass will then send someone to the home where they can then receive the Eucharist that was celebrated at the Mass. But this broadcast of live services, and now in cyberspace we're seeing more and more streaming of live services. I know of a number of churches and pastors who are really trying to make that work, not just, though, for the homebound or folks who can't come, but as an outreach to people who just might be curious about the Catholic faith, might be curious, what does a Mass look like, but aren't comfortable actually walking into the church. This is another way to evangelize or to outreach to the seekers and the curious out there. Now, in the Protestant space, in addition to these live broadcasts, some of them are experimenting with what we might call virtual consecration, where it's a live service and their minister is consecrating the elements for their communion service, and the people at home then have their own bread and wine and put it in front of the computer screen or the TV screen, and you believe then that consecration taking place that's being broadcast has an effect on those elements sitting in the home. Now we'll talk a little bit later about what does that mean in a Catholic context, and do we believe that could happen, but that's something that they are in fact experimenting with in that live space. So there's still a physical person physically praying the prayers, but then consecration via the web or broadcast services, whatever you want to call it. And then finally, the really experimental space is in what we might call digital church, where it's not even that there's any physical gathering of any people that's being broadcast, but a liturgy, if you will, prayer, if you will, in a totally virtual space. One place where this really took off was in the game Second Life, which is a virtual space where people can build houses and do different things and have their own avatar in that space, and then can come together at specific times and have a virtual church service in the virtual church online. So instead of physical bodies gathered, it's these computerized avatars gathering in a computerized church. And then, depending on the technology at their disposal, either through some sort of voice recognition or just through a text recitation, they do the readings, they do the prayers, and then some of them even participate in a digital Eucharist, where on the computer screen there's a representation of the bread and the wine that is then distributed to the digital avatar. So there's not even a physical consumption of the bread and the wine. It's a digital representation of that consumption by the digital representation of the people in the digital representation of the church. And this is probably the most avant-garde of what's really going on right now out there in the digital space, and how does that then feed into our personal spiritual lives and our physical existence? This is what's going on out there, and so you can see there's kind of a whole variety of practices, a whole variety of things that people are experimenting with and thinking about and theologizing on. Now, one other distinction I want to make before we go on is that when we think about these digital spaces, what people are doing online, not everyone is entering into them or participating in the same way. I like to think of kind of a continuum of participation as people come to these digital spaces and engage in them. Not all participation looks alike. So at the most basic would be what we might call lurking. And when we talk about lurking in an online space, it just means you're only observing. You can see what others are doing. They may or may not be able to see your digital representation or your avatar, but you're not typing anything in. You're not participating in any direct way. You're simply observing. It's like you're standing in the shadows while everything else goes on. People may or may not even be aware of your presence there. So no direct participation, no entering into the action or the conversation. Next would be participation more rightly defined, where you're engaging in whatever way the technology allows you to with other people. So this could be as simple as clicking the like button for a Facebook post, to direct conversation through text messaging or Skype or other things, to content creation itself, where you're actually creating some of these things. So a little more than just watching, but actually participating. And then finally, we can think about leadership, where you're not just participating, but you're actively seeking to engender these things and create the spaces and gather people at specific times, taking a leadership role in these online practices. Now, I think we can also see, though, that these different continuums of participation also take place in physical spaces. There are people in our churches on Sunday who just sit, don't really participate. They could be, in a sense, lurking in our churches. I had a pastor a couple of months ago say to me that his cry room is full, and it's not with babies and parents, it's with the curious, the seekers in his community who feel comfortable coming into the cry room, but they're not comfortable coming into the church. And so he's wrestling with, how do I reach out to these people who are lurking in his cry room, aren't directly participating? How can he move them from that kind of lurking behavior into more direct participation in the Mass? And then leadership. There's plenty of people who are actually in leadership roles in our parishes, helping with the liturgy, helping with faith formation, all these things. So there's a correlation here between what happens in the physical world and what happens in these digital spaces. In some sense, we're kind of replicating in digital spaces what is already going on in our churches, in our communities. So what challenges, then, does this bring to the particular Catholic experience of understanding the faith in its physical space? And then what does that mean then as we move into virtual spaces? Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is participation in online activities has kind of accelerated the Enlightenment's disintegration of mind and body. And there's plenty of smarter people than me who have written and thought about this, but the Enlightenment kind of starts with that statement by Descartes that I think, therefore I am. in this formulation, the self is first identified with thought, absent any embodied experience. So even before the Enlightenment thinkers think about the body and what it means to exist in time and space, they start with that disembodied consciousness itself. That self-reflective consciousness in and of itself is identified as the self. Now this has developed into kind of the modern sci-fi conceit that the self consists just in the brain activity. And we can think of plenty of science fiction examples of human thought patterns or brains being transferred into robotic or digital bodies. And what's basically taken for assumption there is that the person is the same. They may just be switching bodies, but they remain the same. Their body has no direct bearing on the self, on the human person. And so it's just the thought itself, it's just the consciousness itself that's identified as the person. Now this butts up against with our Catholic belief and our Catholic experience. And there's a couple of statements from the Catechism that I think are very enlightening about this. In Numbers 364 to 365, the Catechism says, "The human body shares in the dignity of the image of God. It is a human body precisely because it is animated by a spiritual soul. The unity of soul and body is so profound that one has to consider the soul to be the form of the body. That is, it is because of its spiritual soul that the body made of matter becomes a living human body. Spirit and matter in man are not two natures unified, but rather their union forms a single nature." In other words, our physical nature is intrinsic to our very being. And we can see this right at the start of sacred scripture, where God fashions Adam out of physical matter and then breathes life into him. The human soul, the human person, doesn't exist before the body. But it is only with the body that the soul can enter in and the person can actually become a human person. And sacred scripture regularly attests to the wonder of our physical creation by God. You think of Jeremiah's great passages on the potter and the clay, God working to make us. Jesus saying that God cares for the very hairs on our heads. If our physical bodies didn't matter, then what matter would our hairs be on our head? But God so loves us that even the very hairs on our head, which would seem to be nothing, are profoundly loved and cared for by God. So we need to get away from this kind of modern notion that body and mind are separate and that we can have one without the other. In our Catholic understanding, the human body and the human spirit or the soul or consciousness have to be joined. You cannot separate one from the other. Now, the challenge then is that people online tend to exist in that kind of enlightenment ideal as disembodied consciousness. They're a non-physical digital avatar that represents them in that world. But there's no physicality there beyond kind of the pixels on the screen. I kind of liken it to if you've seen The Matrix. The people just are represented by this non-physical avatar, and they can do whatever they want. Now that may be mediated through our immediate senses. We see what's happening with our avatar through the screen, through our sight. If there's sound, we hear it through the speakers, through our ears. We can interact through touch with the keyboard, but it's easy to forget that kind of mediation. It's easy to forget that this non-physical avatar we're seeing with our senses. And people who play video games know this. You can kind of become blinded to what's actually going on around you and really start to identify with that avatar and think that you're experiencing what's going on there. Even to the point where, I know about 6-7 years ago, there was a series of articles about people actually dying while playing kind of marathon sessions of online games. These massively multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft or StarCraft or things like this, that they would become so immersed in the game that they would forget their own physical needs and eventually kind of drop from exhaustion. And there was a number of deaths, especially in Korea, where this kind of game addiction has really become a real problem in their culture. We can start to identify too closely and forget that we are a physical body that has needs, that has things that we have to provide for it in order to continue our existence. So we need to be careful that this digital avatar doesn't become who we are, in part because these digital avatars are very temporary and they're very highly mutable, by which I mean it's easy to change them. and again, Second Life is kind of a good example of this, where people can create clothes or tattoos or things for their avatar, and just with a few clicks they can change their entire appearance online. Now contrast that with our permanent, much harder to change physical bodies, where this is the only one we have. It's permanent. We can't just change it on a whim. That would pretty much negate our existence if we tried to do that. Similarly, it's hard to change our physical bodies, unlike those digital avatars. If it were easier to change, I would have a much easier time losing weight than I do. But we can't just with a few clicks change our physical appearance. And I have this theory, I don't know if anyone's done any studies on this, but I have this theory that the fact that people are used to changing their avatars online, and that includes Facebook pictures, your profile picture on Facebook, your Twitter avatar, all these different things, people are so used to changing these things easily and regularly that it's reflected now in this kind of increasingly radical body modification. When you think about the proliferation of whole body tattoos, piercings in different parts of the bodies, those earplugs, those big holes that people now we're starting to see in people's ears, to much more radical stuff as well. People are really radically changing their appearance to mimic celebrities and things like that. I think part of that is because we're so used to this digital space where we can just be whatever we want to be, where our digital representation has no bearing on what we actually look like. So what then does this mean for participation? Recall that full conscious active participation is one of the hallmarks of the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, and not just in the liturgy, but in the whole of the life of the Church. We're to participate fully as much as possible in all aspects of the Church's life. But what does that mean when people aren't physically present? How can we participate with one another when we aren't physically with each other? Christ promised that he would be there where 2 or 3 are gathered. That's obviously where we took the title for today's webinar. But the question I think we need to wrestle with is that true in cyberspace? Is Christ with us when we are gathered in a non-physical place? Now, I think there's certainly some way that has to be true. We are with each other in a way, but are we truly present with each other? And just for example, in some ways, I'm more present to you right now than you are present to me. You can hear me at the start of the presentation, you could see me, but I cannot hear you, I cannot see you. I don't know what you're doing or what you're thinking. That's one of the challenges actually in doing these kind of webinars, is there's no audience feedback. I can't see if people are bored or anything like that with what I'm saying. The only interaction I really have from you to me is through what you type into those question boxes, which will then be relayed to me by Jarrett. So how are we really with each other? How are we really present to each other? I recently read a catechetical article where a person talked about participating in what was going on in St. Peter's Square during the conclave in Rome a year ago, and how important that was to her to feel present and like she was participating in that space. I thought, oh, this is really cool. And so I went to her Twitter feed and discovered she hadn't actually typed anything during that time. She hadn't actually put herself out there and talked with other people who were in the square. She was just lurking. And that made me question, well, in what way was she really participating then? Was she really present? Was she really participating in what was going on in that square if no one knew she was there online, if no one knew that she was reading their tweets and thinking about them and praying with them? Again, I don't have an answer to that, but I think those are the kinds of questions that we really need to ask ourselves as people are increasingly using online technologies for this kind of faith interaction. Put another way, digital spaces make it harder, but not necessarily impossible, to be authentically present. And I want to focus here on that word, authentically present, because the digital self is almost always an idealized self. If you think again about Second Life or World of Warcraft, the avatars that are present in those games rarely, if ever, reflect the real bodies of their controllers. You can idealize yourself online through the way you create your avatar's body, their dress, things like that. But this is even true in more mundane ways. Facebook profile pictures, we tend to choose deliberately to put ourselves in the best light. Even the picture that I showed at the start of this presentation, doesn't reflect how I look most of the time, and certainly not how I look first thing in the morning. It's a nice picture of me that I had taken by a good photographer in our cathedral, so that when I do presentations I can give it to folks and it lets people know what I look like, but it's an idealized self. It's not how I normally look. I I want to put my best foot forward. So if we present ourselves online in a way that highlights the best of ourselves and minimizes our flaws, are we being authentically present? If we're only seeing the good parts of ourselves, can we come together as a church of sinners in need of a Savior? Think about it another way. If we only see the best features, we're less likely to be confronted by images of the poor and the neglected. And what does this mean when we're being called by the Holy Father to be a church for the poor? Can we do that in an online space if we aren't being authentically present to one another? And this idealized self doesn't just apply to ourselves, but to the representation of physical activities in a digital space. Going back to that article by Tom MacDonald, he points out in there that digitalized farming is really an idealized version of farming. It's nice and clean, it's antiseptic, there's no smell of cow manure, there's no birthing livestock in freezing temperatures, there's no drought or flooding endangering your livelihood. A real farmer would probably take a look at that and say, that's not even close to what real farming is like. There's no hardship. You don't have to clear brush, you just do it with a click of your finger, as opposed to putting real muscle and effort into it. And I think this can be true for online prayer as well. If we think about some of these digital spaces, because you have to program into these avatars gestures and things like that, they become very uniform so that when someone kneels in those spaces, it looks like the way everyone else kneels. When they fold their hands, it's the same way everyone else folds hands. It creates a uniformity that's just not present in real-life churches. There's no dust on digital pews. We don't kind of see the run-downness of our churches that reflects how people have prayed and lived there over the years. I kind of like when I walk into an old church, seeing where the pews, the stain of them has been rubbed down to the bare wood, because that speaks to me of the generations of people who have sat in these pews and prayed and worshiped together. And I think a really telling example is that digital candles don't burn. In many digital churches, avatars can light a digital candle to represent their prayer, just as we do in real churches, going and lighting a candle for our prayers. But the lack of a physical candle really kind of robs the symbol of one of its most poignant aspects. The candle gives of itself in order to provide light. The wax burns and is burned away, and the candle goes down over time because it has to give of itself in order to produce light. Digital candles illumine without sacrifice, and so we lose that connection to the crucifixion. In many ways, digital candles symbolize a Christ without the cross. This is why in physical churches, electric candles really aren't an ideal symbol. Now, for certain reasons, they may be necessary, and I've worked in hospitals before, and certainly in a lot of those, because of safety issues and things like that, chapels have had to use electric candles. But it's certainly not the best way that we symbolize what Christ's light means to us. So the fact that digital candles don't burn really makes them a less than ideal symbol, and then that's going to affect the way that we approach our faith if our symbols aren't representing the fullness of what we know and believe. So this leads then to the question, can we celebrate the sacraments online? Knowing that other traditions are experimenting with this and seeing if they can make it work, from a Catholic understanding, can we celebrate the sacraments online? And from what I have seen, it does not appear so. Sacraments, of course, require form and matter. It's not just what we do, but it's what we have in front of us. Baptism, real baptism, requires water. Eucharist requires bread and wine to be transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Even in the other ones, Holy Order requires the laying on of hands, the physical presence of hands. And even in matrimony, you have to have the man and the woman together to effect true matrimony. You can't conduct a wedding over the internet. It would be ludicrous to think that you have a computer screen standing up there next to the woman and the man's face just there, as if that was the same as man and woman coming together. There's no such thing as a disembodied sacrament. Sacraments require the physical because God made the physical holy. That's part of what we understand the Incarnation to have been, that Christ became man so that we might then join him in his divinity. The prayer that we used at the beginning of the webinar speaks very powerfully to that. We're reminded of that every Christmas, that we pray that we will share in Christ's divinity because he shared in our humanity, not just the soul and the consciousness, but the physical embodiment of humanity that Christ took on. That's how we understand that. And I think looking at what the Church has had to say in other situations, certainly I mentioned before the USCCB's 1997 statement on televised masses makes it pretty clear that true participation in the sacraments requires physical presence at them. Now again, that doesn't mean that we stop televising masses or stop streaming them, but to truly participate, to truly be present in them means physical participation. It means that we have to be with one another in these physical spaces. So what does that mean then when we try to bridge physical faith and virtual faith? And I want to offer 3 suggestions on how we can make that work. The first is that we shouldn't be afraid of people living their faith online. We need to cultivate good online Catholic communities. Online faith sharing is not a bad thing. It can be a very true good in the lives of people. I'm thinking specifically here of people who are isolated, who may be in missionary territory or in communities where there's a minority of Catholics compared to other faith traditions. Having good online communities can be a way for them to tap into the universal church, to help them to locate people that they can share their faith with and be built up with and share their longings and their prayers and their needs in a way that may not be as fully possible because of where they live. But even in places where that's not necessarily the case, good online communities can help people more connect with their local communities. I think particularly of good parish Facebook pages can help people to tap into what's going on in their parish, whether that's using that to post prayer intentions or announcements about upcoming faith formation opportunities or special liturgies or things like that. It can be a way during those other 6 days of the week that people are able to tap into what's going on in their local communities and then be drawn into greater participation in them. Benedict XVI said we need to evangelize the digital continent, and good online communities can do that. Not just in word, because of course evangelization is always word and deed. And so it's not just what we write about online, but it's how we participate with one another online. It's how we comment in comments on blogs. Are we being trolls and trying to stir up trouble and being negative? Or are we seeking to understand? Are we anticipating that people are going to come to the conversation with open hearts and open minds? Are we approaching people ourselves with openness and not just with trying to be right online and things like that? Evangelization requires not just what we write, but how we write. And there's lots of examples online of faith communities that have really been dragged down because of bad participation on the part of the faithful and seeking to beat other people down in the faith rather than build them up. Second, then, once we have a line into these online communities, it can be a great opportunity to invite the digital faithful to participate in person. Again, physical communities is the most best, if you will, of what it means to come together as Christians. When we are physically present, we are most present to each other in our full humanness, body and soul. Online communities should ideally lead to greater participation in the Church's life, by which we mean liturgy, faith formation, apostolic works, personal prayer and devotions. It should lead out of the digital space into the real world because we are called to serve one another. And we have to do that physically as well as spiritually. And then finally, and this is where I really think there's some interesting conversations and thinking to be had, is what does all of this mean then for sacramental preparation? And I think one thing we need to keep in mind when we're doing sacramental prep, whether that's in RCIA or whether that is with children, is to stress the importance of physical symbols. It's not just the form that matters, but the physicalness of the sacraments is intrinsic to their nature. We have to stress that it is the water of baptism that cleanses us, spiritually and physically, and to reflect on what that means. My 2 oldest sons were just confirmed on Sunday. What does it mean to have that oil spread on their foreheads? What does it smell like? What does it feel like? It gets into everything. Oil is very slippery. And what does that mean then for our faith and how we understand that sacrament? But it's not just the sacraments that we can think about the importance of physical symbols, but other good and holy things in our lives. I have a few objects. My father passed away while I was in college, and I have a few objects of his that are very, very important to me because they maintain that connection between me and him. I have his rosary. I have a prayer card that he was given in 1950 by his aunt, who was a Franciscan sister. But even beyond holy objects, that I can have a shawl that was my grandmother's that she loved and wore to church every Sunday, and I have that now, and it helps me. Those physical things help to connect us to the past of our families and our faith. We need to stress that and let people know those are important. These physical things connect us in a way that digital realities just can't. And then the importance of just understanding physical creation itself, that through the physical world around us we come to understand God, we understand our Creator, that He gave us these signs to express and experience our faith, so that we can give wonder to God that after a day yesterday when we had sleet and snow and hail all in one day, that today it's a beautiful, gorgeous day here in Springfield, Illinois, that reflects God's creation and our understanding of God, and we give thanks to Him for that through the physicalness of the earth. I think there's a lot that we can do when talking to folks, especially in our faith formation programs, to help them understand physical things matter. It's not this enlightenment discontinuity between the mind and the body. They are one and whole, and we need them both. And that is going to help us to experience and understand our faith in a greater and greater way. So with that, Jared, I think we have plenty of time for some question and answers. I cannot wait to hear what people have to say.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to take controls back so you don't have to worry about
sure.
what's on your screen there. Okay, here we go. Yeah, we have a number of questions coming in, or comments, I guess, too. I think this is a great conversation starter, Jonathan. I really appreciate the time you took to give us this presentation, to share some thoughts and ideas about a very significant turning point that we're in our culture and in our church. So, yeah, so I'm very eager to hear what people have to say. We have some good questions coming in already. If anybody else wants to chime in with some of their own questions for Jonathan, some of the things that he talked about, I will start with a few, and then as some other ones come in, we'll read them to you as well, Jonathan. My
Sounds
first
great.
one to you is personally, because you and I have connected online before, and certainly neither one of us are lurkers, and at some point you made the decision to go from kind of participation into actual leadership online. I mean, you are, for your job, working in a diocese and doing catechesis and evangelization, but you've also taken some time a few years back to becoming a leader in the online space. What was it that tipped your hat and going in that direction and to being a participant in a larger way?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. I think it was just seeing others doing it. There's so many great online communities that have formed around Catholic faith and questions, and very specific communities. When I give presentations on what it means to be a Catholic online, I point to the fact that you can get very, very granular in terms of interests, to the point where there's podcasts on the intersection of faith and Star Wars. There's the Catholic Drinky site I always like to point people towards, where that blogger likes to talk about the intersection of alcohol and faith. And I can't remember if it's coming up or if she's done it already, but she has enough of a following now that she has done a pilgrimage to France, where they're going to go and visit some holy sites and shrines, and hopefully get to experience some good French wine while they're at it. But it was just seeing the possibilities, and it's interesting you mentioned, Jared and I met online before we ever met face-to-face. We've only met face-to-face, less than a handful of times, I think. But it was seeing that there are great catechists and faith formation folks out there looking at what this means, and so it was just kind of a natural progression then for me to get interested myself. I don't have a technical background per se, but I got my first computer when I was in second grade, and so I've always been interested in computers and connecting. And when I got my first email account in college, it's like a whole world opened up to me, and it's always just felt very natural that of course I'm going to bring my faith to that. And there's just so many, like I said, interesting communities that are out there for me. I guess the leadership part just comes from wanting to see what's possible, and there was stuff I was seeing that people weren't doing that I thought, well, this could be interesting to try. And so, things like these webinars and the online book study and things like that, I won't say I've gotten them perfect by any means, but I think the more we do them and more we encourage others to do them, the better we're going to get at it.
Good, Jonathan. There's some great conversations starting, great questions and comments coming in. I'm going to read some of them to you
Great.
to either respond to or to answer. One is kind of, I guess, a technical question. Is from Pam. She says, besides Facebook, what are the best online platforms for parishes? I'm guessing she means to build online communities.
Sure. I think Facebook's good. Facebook has been going through some changes with their algorithm, which is kind of their code for how they display people's timelines. So that used to be on Facebook, anything from anyone that you were connected to would show up in that front page, and you could scroll down and see everything. Nowadays, though, Facebook's getting much more picky about what they put on that space so that you may be missing stuff. And this has really kind of led me to be a little more bearish on Facebook for parish work because it's harder to get your stuff visible to people. Now, I still think there's still good to be had out of Facebook, but I'm starting to think more and more that parish blogs could be a great tool for creating that kind of community because you have the opportunity to post a homily or a reflection or something, and then allow people in the comment sections to have that conversation, to have that back and forth, to add their own experiences, their own thoughts, linked to other resources. So I think there's a lot to be done in parish blog spaces. Now, people are sometimes intimidated by that, setting up a blog and getting the software right. But honestly, it's gotten a lot easier nowadays. And even just setting up something on a free site like WordPress or Blogspot, things like that, it's pretty much you can be up and running in 5 minutes without any real investment. The hard part is creating regular good content. A blog that hasn't been posted to in a couple of weeks, people aren't going to continue to come back to. So the hard part is that content generation. The software side's easy. Beyond that, Instagram, I think, can be interesting. If you're into, especially media content generation, being able to post pictures, if you have someone who's really in on internet memes and can adapt those to a Catholic space, a friend of mine up in Chicago, Ashley, who works for the Archdiocese up there, does a wonderful job of creating these kind of Catholic memes, pictures that people can share. I think that's another great space that's underutilized by parishes. I'm real big on Twitter, but I have to admit I have a hard time tweeting institutionally. I'm kind of the main Twitter person for our diocese, and I find it difficult to strike the right balance between personability while not trying to seem flip or glib on behalf of the diocese. Twitter I've always found to be it's wonderful at expressing your personal style, your personal humor, things like that. So I find that a little harder to do on behalf of an institution, but there's things coming out all the time, it seems, in these spaces, and so jumping on early and experimenting is it's always kind of my recommendation that just see what's out there, grab your name, for lack of a better word, whatever your handle is, grab it early on anything that's new, just on the off chance that it becomes the new big thing.
No, I think that's a great answers all across the board. I mean, there's so many different options, and it's easy to be stressed out. And
Yeah.
I think one of the things I'll also say, just that depending on what group you're talking to. I mean, you mentioned Instagram, and I think you're right. There's a lot of places, Catholic organizations that are doing great work on Instagram because they're trying to connect with the youth, and that's where the youth are. So, some other kind of theological questions here, which I just throw out at you. One is, I'll give you one. Here's this is how do you feel about online Eucharistic adoration? This is from Elizabeth.
It's not something I've done myself. I've just never been in a position where I've had that opportunity or been aware of when that would be available. I know that there are sites out there that have a webcam, sometimes even 24/7, on the Eucharist for that kind of adoration. Again, as Catholics, I always like to default to kind of a both-and, where it's a good, to be able to reflect on the mystery of the Eucharist is always a good thing. But doing it digitally is never going to be as good as being in that physical presence, as being in the chapel, being on the pew. So again, I think I would default to kind of what the bishop's thinking with televising the Mass. That yes, it's a good for those people that need it. And if you've just got 5 minutes in the day and can't get to a church, sure, maybe jump online and do that. But the better portion is to actually go to the Eucharist, to kneel before it in the chapel, in the church, to be present, to see the light of the candles, to smell the incense. That's always the better part, to engage all those senses and not just what we can get via a computer screen. So I'll take the both and answer on that one.
Good. No, thank you. Tina has a great question for you as a person working in a diocese. Tina says, how do you work within diocesan online guidelines with monitoring and allowing comments to be posted?
Oh, wow. You know, that's something I go back and forth with people all the time, because it's all over the place depending on what your diocesan guidelines are. You know, my diocese, about two and a half years ago, we developed social media guidelines, and I was very pleased, partly because I had a hand in helping to craft them, but we started from a position of being positive about social media and saying, this is the church has asked us to do this. Ever since the Second Vatican Council, when you look at the decree on social communication, we're to use means of modern communication to reach out to the world. And so we started from that position that this is something we should be doing, we want to encourage people to do. Now, how you then respond in terms of comments and things like that, my default is always, and what our diocese has recommended to parishes is, start by being open, start by allowing comments. Don't assume that people are going to be bad actors. Deal with them when you need to, and we actually have a process that we've recommended. Actually, I believe what we have was developed by the USCCB, who they themselves, I think, stole it from other dioceses. But it's really almost a flow chart of, if you get a comment, what do you do? And the basics of it is, if it's a nice comment, say thank you. If it's a question, if it seems to be asked, even if it doesn't seem to be asked, but if it's a question that you can honestly engage the question. Even if it seems to be asked in a sarcastic manner, assume good intentions. At the very least, you're helping to get good information out to people, because someone else may see that question. If you don't respond, well, they may just think that the person has a point if they're being sarcastic or trying to be pointed. And then when you get a true bad actor, someone who's using bad language, who's obviously not engaged in any kind of constructive criticism or conversation, that's then when you look at deleting comments and ultimately even banning people. And we've had to do that in our diocese. We've had a couple of instances where Facebook pages come under attack, and we've had to delete comments and ban people. But we use that flowchart, and a question asked, we will answer. And then obviously if it's a spam comment or something like that, you ban the spammer. But I will, on my website, I've got my notes and everything for this presentation. I will add a link to our diocesan social media guidelines, which includes that flowchart and everything. Because, again, you want to start with engagement, because that's where the social of social media comes into play. You want that interaction. You want to be able to engage people. And so when you shut down comments, when you don't allow people to comment, you're losing a lot of the value of that. It goes from being an interactive medium to just being a broadcast medium. And people just won't come back for broadcast that much unless it's really, really, really engaging content. And I can guarantee most dioceses aren't generating content that's as engaging as what people can find on YouTube.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's great. I love that assume good intention kind of principle when you're responding. It's a really great tagline. Yeah, thank you for linking to that on your website. It's jonathanfsullivan.com, and that's where you'll find. Sounds like you're going to be posting some of your notes as well as at least link to that flowchart. Is that right, Jonathan?
Absolutely, and then my slides, my notes to everything will all be up on the website.
Excellent, great. Okay, so some more questions coming in and comments. We have two questions about youth. Chrysalyn she's from Hawaii, and she's saying that their diocese has really put a strong emphasis on youth and young adults in their strategic plan. And Janet asks a more pointed question. I like it. She says, could you talk about engaging youth who are so in tuned into the digital world, using tools and resources to engage them, but also bridging the actual participation, I'm guessing, in physical communities?
Sure. And let me start with the caveat. I am not a youth minister. I've never been a youth minister. God bless all of you youth ministers out there. It is something that is just not my gifts to do. Again, I think it's about creating safe spaces where they can ask questions, where they can experiment a bit with good guidance. And that's why we need to be present in those online spaces in order to be there when those questions are asked, to be there when people are questioning, what does it mean to be Catholic in a digital space, where we can guide them to good resources like good blogs and good resources from USCCB and the Vatican and all of these wonderful places. I think it's about, again, understanding that they're going to be asking and asking these questions, and they may seem pointed to us, and they may seem challenging to us, but that's part of youth. Adolescents are at that point in life where they're starting to push back against authority, where they're starting to get their own legs underneath them, where they're not relying on the faith of their parents or even the faith of their communities, but trying to make that faith their own. And so helping them to participate in ways that are appropriate, that point towards that greater reality, and allowing them to do the digital and the physical as well. We kind of have this perception that kids, whatever they're doing, their faces are down, they're in their cell phones, they're not engaged, they're not paying attention. I'm not always sure how true that is. There's been a number of commercials out now where it shows kids on vacations or things like that, and their faces are down, and they don't seem to be engaging anything around them. And then at the end of the commercial, it turns out they've been creating videos, or they've been putting together online scrapbooks so that they can share with their parents. This is what we saw on our vacation, things like that. Allowing teens and youth who are comfortable with those technologies, allowing them to do that in our spaces, I think can help to engage them by helping them to actually pay attention, so that allowing teens, for instance, to bring their cell phones with them to adoration or to youth activities or things like that. Yes, there may be times we need to ask them to put them away, but try to engage them through it and ask them, we need your help. We want to get lots of good pictures of this event. Help us to take pictures. Help us to take video. Share them with us so we can share them to the wider community. Now, of course, we have to be careful in terms of protection of children and things like that. I always use the guideline of the 3 pieces of information you never want in the same place are a child's name, their picture, and their location. 2 of 3 is okay, but when you have all 3, that's when safety really becomes a concern. So my advice to parishes is always, if you're going to post pictures of kids or videos of kids, make sure there's no identifying information in terms of names, address, things like that attached to it. Because obviously you've got the picture, you've got, at least in a sense, the location, because folks will be able to know they're attached to your church or your parish. So don't put their names with it. That's kind of my guideline. But I think the overall principle is, allowing them these spaces to engage their digital selves in the physical spaces can be one way of doing that. We're not going to tell you to put that stuff away and not do it. We want you to help us to be better at it. Because the teens are, they're the ones that are really engaging this in really interesting ways. I sometimes ask in presentations, and I haven't had anyone really give me what I thought was a satisfactory answer. Has there ever been a time in human history when it's young people who are experts at things that the adults are not? When we look at how kids are engaging in online activities and using these tools, they're much more comfortable and expert at them than the adults are. So I'm like, if someone has an answer, I'd love to hear it. I haven't heard what I thought was a really good one yet, but let's tap into that expertise. Let's tap into that experience, that enthusiasm, and help to then engage people around it.
Good, thanks, Jonathan. Just some feedback that's coming in. There are more comments, I think, than questions. I think one thing you talked about was the candle and the symbolism of a candle and its place in the digital world. And I definitely resonated with that. I think 2 other people in the comments in the questions section have also said different things about that. So thank you for that reflection. We have a few other questions with the time we have here. One is about how to find a good virtual community. Let me find the question. See how they worded it. Since I can't find it, what I remember it saying, and I can't remember, so I apologize for the person who asked it. But do you have any advice for someone who's looking to find a good virtual Catholic community? Jonathan, you said you have a couple that you're participating in. For someone who's just looking right now, where would they go to start to find something?
I can give you some of my favorites, but I would by no means say that this is an exhaustive list. I mean, I only have so many hours in the day, so I can't participate in everything. But especially for the folks that are in on a webinar like this, something like the newevangelizers.com, which has a number of podcasts and videos and blogs and things like that around the new evangelization. There's some really wonderful conversation and things happening there. Just search for blogs around the topic that you're looking for. Obviously I'll plug Jared's blog, thereligionteacher.com, which is a wonderful one for catechists and catechetical leaders, posting good information, good conversation in the comments, things like that. And then Facebook, search for your local parish and see what's going on there. Or the USCCB is another one on Facebook. For all the guff I sometimes give the USCCB in the past for not being really with it, their digital media efforts have really been outstanding. And their Facebook page, I think, is really a model for what we can be doing with our parishes in terms of good, regular updates, engaging people in conversation, helping people to ask good questions and participate with each other. So those would be, a few places I would recommend to start with. But just search for blog, Catholic, and then whatever you're interested in. Places like CatholicMom.com if you're a mom that wants to know more about living the faith as a mother, things like that. There's just about something for everyone at this point, if you can just look for it.
Good, thanks, Jonathan. I think we're running out of time, and I think I just want to one thing I wanted to ask about, but I just think maybe I'll just put it out there as a challenge for all of us to think about is your exact description of the opportunities we have with these virtual communities to be able to reach the people who feel left out, the people who are in Church of Sinners, and we want to be the church for the poor. How do we develop virtual communities that welcome people as almost a virtual crying room in the way you described that experience? So.
Yeah, and let me just add by just saying, don't assume that those people aren't online. I mean, we're at the point now where, a simple cell phone anymore is many people's tools to getting online. The internet is burgeoning in the third world because of smartphones. They don't access the internet through tablets or computers or things like that, but it's cell phones now that are really helping to kind of bridge that digital divide. So don't assume they're not there. They are. They may not always be recognizable, but they're there as well. So yes, absolutely, being welcoming of all, especially the poor, especially the outcasts, is absolutely vital in our evangelization efforts.
Good. JonathanFSullivan.com. Jonathan, anything else? Any place else you want to send people to find you and connect with you online?
I'm on Facebook at facebook.com/Jonathan F. Sullivan, and my Twitter handle is twitter.com/SULLIJO. So please feel free to contact me through theirs. I do have a blog post up with all the notes and everything here. If there's a question you really wanted answered, just put it in the comments on that blog post, and I'll be happy to try to answer it there.
Good. Thanks so much, Jonathan. One last thing before we sign off, I want to say thank you to the partners, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils. If you're not familiar with their organizations, please go check out their websites as well. If you're not already connected to Ave Maria Press online, go ahead and connect with us at Facebook or Twitter or YouTube or Vimeo, where these video recordings will be posted. You can also find the recording at avemariapress.com/webinar-videos, and we'll have this recording as well as all the recordings going back to 2010 of the webinars we've been doing for parish leaders. So for the next webinar, which will be on Tuesday, February 25th at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, we'll host another panel, this time welcoming 4 experts in Catholic young adult ministry to talk about their experience starting and growing ministries focused on reaching adults, Catholics, in their 20s and 30s. So join me as I welcome Amy S. McKenchie, the Interim Director of the National Catholic Young Adult Ministry Association, Colin Ikaza from the Archdiocese of New York, Jonathan Lewis, the Coordinator of Evangelization and Young Adult Initiatives in the Archdiocese of Washington, and Sean Allen, the Young Adult Minister for the Diocese of Fort Wayne and South Bend. So thanks everybody so much, and we'll see you on February 25th at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. Jonathan, thanks again for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for the invitation, Jared.
Okay, take care. God bless.
You too.